All right. Well, welcome back. Although it's been a little while since we've had a video. Last week we didn't have any videos for you to watch because you guys had working on your project and you guys were doing your test. So we're going to be beginning chapter 24. We're going to cover things pretty quickly. Although, mostly really we got this week, next week is regular weeks, and then finals weeks. All we've got left. So I'm mostly going to be trying to give you guys time to continue working on your final assignment, but we'll be giving you some information also on some things we haven't covered yet. So, for the beginning of what you want to answer on your notes, you want to put something famous from this day in history, April 28th, and a famous birthday from this day in history, April 28th. Um, so, where we left off, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, had been killed in Dallas, Texas. We looked a little bit at how it does seem that, that is one conspiracy I can kind of get on board with a little bit because the evidence seems to point that it could not be done by a lone gun. As far as who did it, what the reasoning is, that's where the questions really lie in my mind, and it's hard to really decipher that. Um, but as John F. Kennedy died on Air Force One, as they were leaving Dallas, Texas, Lyndon Johnson was sworn into office as the next president of the United States. Lyndon Johnson was a very skilled politician. He had years and years of experience in government. He began his career as uh, in Congress in 1931 as a congressional secretary. He was elected to Congress in 1937, and then he was elected to the Senate in 1948. But that basically means from 1931, here he is, November 22nd, 1963, becoming president. He'd already been in government for 32 years. As a senator, he eventually became the party leader of the Democrat Party and the majority leader of the Senate in 1955 because the Democrats controlled Congress. So he continually had a presence in government, had built up relationships with a lot of those people in the Senate and Congress. And really, his major strength as a politician was he was good at getting deals done. He was good at building coalitions and getting bills passed. And we're going to talk more about him at the end of this section today. He's a politician. Let's put it that way. He was always looking for anything that was advantageous for a politician to do. Because we're going to talk about some pretty major things that were passed in his time as president here in his term of office. But I wouldn't. Uh, there's going to be some important things passed, and in some ways they're very good. I don't think they had as good results as maybe hoped. Um, but I also don't believe his motives were always pure because of the kind of person he was and things we do know about him, like they are certainly some things we know. So we'll talk about that as we get going. So obviously he's well prepared. He actually has a lot of experience. So he's very highly qualified, as we just discussed. And he believed that the government had the power to eliminate poverty and inequality. So he wanted to make what he called the Great Society, in which government could help all citizens have the opportunity to better themselves uh, politically, socially, and economically. So we're going to look at a couple major things done to help achieve this goal, and then we're going to look at has it achieved the goal that he had hoped for. So one of the important things and a major part of the agenda was civil rights legislation. Uh, and the first and most important of his civil rights bills, because there was multiple ones, was the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. And we'll talk about another thing involved here in a second. It called for an end to a number of racial injustices. It forbid racial discrimination in public buildings, which would include things like restaurants and stores. It promoted the desegregation of public schools, which already had started, but it continued that work. It authorized withholding federal funds from projects or institutions which discriminated against minorities and created the Equal Opportunity Commission. Okay, so um, trying to make sure that there was not racial discrimination. Now, very good thing. So I'm not saying that this is one of the marking achievements of his time in office and a very important moment. Like I said, we're going to look at some of his possible motives later. Um, but there's no denying that this was a move in the right direction. So, Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, which sent federal officials into states to help register blacks to vote. It outlawed literacy tests for voters. Those were often, we already talked about this, those were often administered as the literacy tests, and poll taxes were a part of the Jim Crow laws and the laws that were trying to keep blacks from voting. We also talked about grandfather clauses last year as well. Um, the 24th Amendment was ratified in January of 1964, which outlawed the use of poll taxes, similarly used to prevent black suffrage. Now, this is January 1964. This is only a couple months after he took over for John F. Kennedy. That means this legislation had started before Johnson took office. My point being, uh, and I'm going to talk politics for a minute. Democrats will point to this time and say, look, the Democrats were the ones who gave blacks their rights. I can say right now, the people who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were mostly, I'm not going to say all, but mostly Democrats. Um, Republicans were supported it in much higher numbers than Democrats did. Um, Also, a lot of this stuff was already in the works. And I think whether it was Republican or Democrat president at this point in time, I really mean this. I think you would have saw things like this happen because I think the mood and the move in America was so strong to grant civil rights that both sides, for the most part, I'm not going to say all, but for the most part, were supportive of this um, move. Now, we're going to talk about a Republican here in a minute who was against the civil rights, but we're going to talk about his reasoning is not because he didn't care about black rights. His reasoning is he felt like the government couldn't do anything about all of these things. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. After we talk first about Johnson's next move was to create a war on poverty to get rid of poverty in the United States. A newly formed office was the Office of Economic Opportunity. That's the OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity. The government attacked poverty through job training, job placement programs. Um, Head Start was started for preschoolers. So for poor people, they could send their children to preschool through the Head Start program, something that still exists today. Now, I'm not going to say a whole lot here, but we're going to talk about this more at the end of here and say, did this war on poverty work? Did poverty actually cease to exist? Has it gone down substantially since 1960s, since the mid 1960s when this was passed? And we're going to talk a little bit later, but I'm mentioning it here about single motherhood began to rise a lot during this time period. So you saw it rise to a pretty high level in this time period. Well, let's take ourselves to the 1964 election. Obviously, you have Johnson. He's going to run for reelection. He's going to run against a Republican senator from Arizona named Barry Goldwater. Um, Goldwater, what I would say, is an ultra conservative, and he's known for his honesty. Okay, so let's give a couple things about him. He voted against the Civil Rights Act, 1964. And here's the deal: it's not because he was against equal rights for blacks, but he thought that the bill gave the federal government too much power to interfere in the private lives of citizens. So he really wanted to keep government small, and that's why he voted against it. However, obviously, it could be used against him during the election cycle, and people could say that he was a racist. To this day, some people say that, but people who knew him and what we know about him was that he cared about black people. He just didn't think the government's job was to interfere in the lives of private citizens. And to be fair, a lot of the civil rights stuff that starts here and some of the affirmative action, which comes a little bit later in the 60s, hasn't had the result that some of the people wanted during this time period. Some of the things obviously did work well. Obviously, blacks can vote, and there aren't poll taxes and all those things, which is great. And there aren't all of those things have been deemed not good by the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. Um, so blacks resented Goldwater's vote in civil rights, and Republicans who weren't as conservative did not want to support him. So that obviously leads to a pretty bad formula for getting elected as president. Um, he wasn't. So you have Johnson, who's the ultimate politician, meaning I promise you, Johnson would cater his message to whoever he's talking to try to get their votes. That is not Goldwater. Goldwater's principled in his conservatism, meaning he would say whatever was on his mind and let it be known whether that would get him votes or not. So he wasn't looking to please the audiences with what he said. So, like, for example, he was giving a speech in front of senior citizens in Florida, and he denounced Social Security because he thought the government should not be doing that. It was too much government spending, and he's an ultra conservative. In a speech in Knoxville, he said the government should sell the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was the government running power, electricity in that area. He believed less government and less regulation was the answer. So Goldwater's honesty and not voting for the Civil Rights Act led to an easy victory for Lyndon Johnson. Johnson scored a victory with 61% of the vote, gaining 486 electoral votes. Goldwater only won 52 electoral votes. He won only his home state and 5 states of the Deep South, because even though he was not at all in favor of the Deep South and segregation and blacks not having their rights, they are the ones who voted for him in this particular election. So now that and also on top of this, the Democrats control Congress after this. So Johnson feels he has a mandate to create his great society, to continue trying to end poverty, and quickly passes a whole bunch of legislation. So if you want to know how big the majorities were in in the Senate, Democrats had a majority 68 Democrats to 32 Republicans in the Senate. That's one of the, maybe, I don't know if that's the largest, but that might be the largest majority ever in the Senate for a party. And in Congress, 295 Democrats to 140 Republicans. So huge majorities. Democrats can pretty much push whatever they want. They pushed 89 bills through the legislature, such as a bill increasing federal aid to education, which was $1.5 billion. They passed Medicare, which is a government health insurance program. It was established in 1965 to help elderly people get medical care and designed to ensure the nation's elderly would be able to afford proper medical treatment, but it did so by taxing other Americans in order to pay for the program. So lots of raising of federal spending during this time period and of federal programs. You can kind of think of Johnson a lot like he's like FDR. He believed government was best equipped to fix society's problems. Now, I'm not going to talk the politics of medical care and in this lecture, and we've talked about this stuff kind of in the past. Sadly, there's not a whole lot of good medical options out there. I don't think government-run healthcare is the answer to our current predicament with medical care, but I also think the insurance system we have is also kind of broken. So unfortunately, it's one of those that's complicated. I do believe, I'm pretty much a conservative in a lot of ways, as you guys are well aware. So in some areas, I believe there's clear-cut answers, but medical care is not a clear-cut answer. I don't believe, like I said, I don't believe government-run medical health care would be a move in the right direction, but the system we have also isn't the right system either. There's so many issues with that particular one. Well, during this time period, too, the Supreme Court began what we would call judicial activism. In fact, Earl Warren would even use that phrase in some ways. This would be a way of interpreting the law of the Constitution broadly in order to address what judges perceive as major social problems. So Earl Warren is going to have a major effect on society during this time period. Dwight Eisenhower appointed 5 Supreme Court justices to the bench while he was president. Remember, he was a Republican. Two of those were Earl Warren and William Brennan, who were not Republicans and were very liberal in their judgments. Once asked whether he had made any mistakes while he was president, Eisenhower said, quote, yes, two. And they are both sitting on the Supreme Court. So these people lead to a use of the court to try to push through social agendas. Now, Roe v. Wade, to legalize abortion doesn't happen during this time period, so we're not going to address that right now. But some of these members, not Earl Warren, but some of these members who would be appointed by these Democrat presidents would still be on the board, and you would still continue to have a very liberal Supreme Court for quite some time. So obviously a positive. Brown versus the Board of Education was passed during this time period. That's from 1954, but we talked about that last chapter. Miranda versus Arizona, which required the criminal suspects be informed of their constitutional rights before they could be questioned. That's actually a good one, but you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against blah, 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 blah. It's called Miranda rights because of this Supreme Court case. But on a more negative note, Engel versus Vitale. In 1962, the Supreme Court banned state-sponsored prayers in public schools as a so-called violation of the First Amendment's guarantee to the separation of church and state. So they banned prayer in public schools because it wasn't okay for separation of church and state. You can ask yourself real quick, do you think the founding fathers would have thought prayer in schools was bad? Probably not, considering they probably all prayed while they were in school and they thought it was fine. But once again, a very broad interpretation of the Constitution and the separation of church and state. That's not even in the Constitution. So however they want to go about that, I guess. In Roth versus United States, the Supreme Court ruled that obscenity was not protected by the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech, which sounds good at first. However, they defined obscenity in a narrow way, making it hard to kind of determine what obscenity even was. So this actually led to a rise in the pornography industry and growth in the pornography industry in the United States in the 1960s, which pretty much didn't exist before this court ruling. So the list goes on because this judicial activism is going to continue after Johnson's time. It's going to continue into Nixon's time. And I know Nixon's a Republican, but Nixon wasn't able to appoint that many to the Supreme Court, at least to sway the opinion in the opposite direction. This activism actually exists for quite some time for the Supreme Court's history. So let's finish here. Let's evaluate the Great Society. And this would mostly be, we're talking about Johnson's maybe I shouldn't say economic, but we're looking at Johnson's domestic programs. Because we're going to talk about the Vietnam War next time and a few other things. But we're going to talk about Vietnam and Johnson's involvement in Vietnam. Because some people would look back and say Johnson was somewhat of a success here, but he's certainly not a success on the Vietnam War. So that will lead to him being pretty unpopular by the time he's in 1968 rolls around. Interestingly, in an effort to create a more peaceful society where there's less poverty and obviously less racial tensions through civil rights, there was more dissent in the aftermath. If you know much about history, and you don't even have to know a lot to know this, late 60s, you had lots of protests, you had anti-war movements, you had the movement of hippies, per se, make love, not war, and they were dissatisfied with what was going on in society. Poverty, since the mid-1960s, has remained nearly unchanged. There literally is hardly any change at all in the poverty level. So I'm going to link in your email today a brief video. It's a pretty short one. It's from PragerU, and it's by a guy I really like, Larry Elder. It mostly deals with blacks and parenthood, which we're going to talk about here, and the lack of fathers in homes. But it does deal with a lot this war on poverty and how since this time period, the poverty level stayed the same. It's been pretty consistent, gone up and down a little bit here and there. But so As far as the war on poverty, it didn't work. There's still just pretty much the same amount of people, percentage wise, impoverished now as there were then. And you may be like, well, how does this lead to single motherhood? Well, the government is giving funds to people who are struggling financially. And this is a fact that I've heard from multiple people. Uh, they won't give you the money if the mom's married, but they will give you the money if the mom's struggling and needs money. Now, I'm not saying that single mothers don't need some help. The thing is, there weren't a lot of single mothers before this time period, which the video is going to show you in great detail. It's actually very convincing information. And this all starts around this time period when the government shows up and basically gives you an incentive not to get married and says, listen, we're going to help you raise your kids. We're going to give you money to do that. We're going to let you use this welfare program to do that. And if the mom gets married, all of a sudden that money will be taken away. Um, that is an incentive to maybe not get married. Now, maybe some of these women still have a boyfriend, but they're not getting married. They're not making that commitment to each other as a result. The video will also go through the amount of children being born out of wedlock, which rose a great deal since the mid 1960s. There was some before that, but not that much. But it's grown at an alarming rate since that time period. And I think you can trace a lot of the breakdown of the U.S. family to this time period. Children need a father and a mother, and you see that less and less today. There are instances where women, if they can have more children, they'll get more money from the government. And you may think this sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm not saying most people do this, but I'm saying there are a small number of people, women who are fine with having more children out of wedlock because it's going to give them more government funds to raise their family. Now, I'm not saying that's very many, but there are some people who take advantage of that system in that way. So if you evaluate this time period, obviously, getting rid of poll taxes, getting rid of all that stuff, great move. And I think the Civil Rights Act, despite the fact that it probably hasn't had some of the results also hoped for long term, um, I got to give credit where credit is due for that one. Now, I'm going to talk about the motives behind that here in a minute, possibly. But the Civil Rights Act did do a lot. The war on poverty hasn't done much. The government is pumping in billions and billions and billions of dollars. In fact, by today's count, if you look through welfare programs, it's probably more like close to a trillion. I'm not going to say it isn't quite a trillion, but it's probably close to $1 trillion is pumped into trying to stop poverty in the United States by our government, and it is not working. It hasn't. It hasn't changed the poverty level. Uh, so progressives say Johnson didn't do enough. That's why society wasn't fixed, because there's still obviously tension in some areas today, that he should have done more government control, government takeover. Conservatives obviously say the government can't fix society's problems, so the more you get the government involved, it's not going to fix it. The problem is something deeper. Now, the root of society's problems, this really is important. And I'm hoping right now, as you're watching this video, you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure I know what Mr. Odell is going to say right now. Because literally, I'm saying literally, if you've had me for the last couple of years, I've probably said this 100 to 200 times. That many times is how many times we've talked about this. But guys, the root of our problems in society and in our lives is sin. Um, at the root of everything, that's the problem. So the government can't fix the sin problem. And I'm not saying poverty is a sin. I'm not saying that at all. But uh, racism is, and the government can't fix that. Now, I think racism is a lot less today than it was in the 1960s and has gotten quite a bit better. But you wouldn't know that by the way things are reported in our society. But the root of our problems is sin, guys. And the government cannot fix that. It will not be able to fix that. And as much as I would love to end poverty, I would love to end it. I wish we had no poor people in the entire world. God never, um, well, let's say Deuteronomy 15:11, God said this, and this is in the Bible. It says, "For the poor shall never cease out of the land." And then he goes on to say, obviously, you need to take care of the poor, which is something we need to do as Christians. and something we need to do as human beings to take care of the poor. But it also says there will always be poor people. It's going to be, unfortunately, a fact of life. Some of them is for terrible circumstances, but some people, I know this for a fact, having worked in churches, there are some people that choose to be poor, that choose homelessness. Some people don't choose it. Maybe they have some mental instabilities or they really are falling on hard times. But there are some that choose to make it a long term choice. And we need to do what we can to take care of them. But I'm just saying there will always be poor people around, and the government can't fix it. Uh, in fact, when the government tries to fix it, that means makes people not try to fix it. And I think it's better when there's personal touch on people because if the government's giving the handouts to try to fix it, that's very impersonal. Whereas if instead, as Christians, we're the one reaching out, trying to help, it gives us a way also to share the gospel of Jesus with those people. So we've talked about the social gospel in the past, and that the negative of it is they only take care of the physical. The problem is for a lot of churchgoers today, they try to take care only of the spiritual. What you need to do is meld the two together. When society is working correctly, I think the best way to take care of people who are poor is to have people in their community, their own family members, church members, people in their community reach out to them personally instead of the government just giving them a check. In the long run, I think that's better. So let's end here with talking about what were Johnson's motives behind all these things. Now, um, I've looked into these things several times, and I will say one of the things I'm going to share. Um, well, it's not a made up statement, but only one person said they heard this. Not that there weren't more people that said it, but only one person has shared it. So that one, I'll be honest with you, we don't know for sure. Maybe the other guy, maybe the guy had some ulterior motive. But we do know from Johnson's past and from the words he said, and we have recordings of these words, like we know he said these things. Um, uh, and these things are, you can look this up if you want, Google it. Um, an article by MSNBC. If you ask me, are they liberal or conservative? Incredibly, incredibly, incredibly left wing. MSNBC is incredibly left. They say Johnson is possibly one of the most racist presidents we've ever had. He consistently used the N word in conversation. Um, he's probably the most vulgar president we've ever had. Now, he didn't do this in public, but we have, I mean, he said some of the nastiest things and just a very vulgar guy. One of the things I'm trying to say is I wouldn't want Johnson as a friend. I'm not joking. He's just the type of person that would annoy me. He's kind of two faced. He does what he can to get what he wants politically and what he thinks will help his political party. He really is driven by that motivation. I say that because the one quote that I am going to say that well, I'm not going to actually say the quote because I don't want to say the N word. But basically, he said he could get black people voting Democrat for 200 years if they pass the Civil Rights Act. Now, this was the one that is only reported by one person. This person was a worker on Air Force One and overheard him saying this to some other people. There are other statements, though, from his past that show that this isn't out of question, that he might not have said this. But it does call into question were Johnson's motives that he incredibly cared for black people? Or was it that his motives were, hey, let's do this because politically it's a good move for us long term? So, you know, I know I'm throwing a little bit of shade on Lyndon Johnson, and we're going to see his moves in Vietnam aren't very good. Um, but, for all the things he was trying to do, it didn't achieve a lot of the goals that he wanted. On top of the fact that, like I said, his motives may not have been that pure. Like I said, you can look more into that. It is a little bit harder to find that one particular thing. I've had to look at it from a lot of different angles, but it is unanimously pretty much agreed upon by people on the left and the right that Johnson did have some racial tendencies and was a vulgar, not very nice person. He definitely, and I'm saying this isn't rumored. He definitely had quite a few affairs on his wife. Just not a real positive individual. Definitely didn't have a lot of character, the type of character you would look for in a man that's leading our country. So um, we'll sign off here, I do want you to answer one last question, as I've been doing pretty much with all of these. This time, I want you to answer, what is your favorite? I don't think I did this one with you because you guys, uh, yeah, I'm very positive I did. I want you to name your favorite fast food restaurant. So uh, just put that at the end of your notes or your last questions. Um, so I'm going to sign out. Hope you guys are doing well, and we'll see you soon. We have a Zoom meeting tomorrow, so see you then.